In 1988, Corey Haim was the uncrowned king of Hollywood, driving a bright red Ferrari without a license, sporting expensive Versace suits, and supporting his entire family with his $1 million smile. The world seemed to be in the hands of this 16-year-old, where money flowed in like a waterfall and fame seemed limitless. However, just 2 decades later, this king rested peacefully, carrying with him a horrifying secret absorbed under the spotlight. His downfall was not simply a matter of finances, it was the result of a work of insidious manipulation by Hollywood's most powerful predators. From the heights of fame, he was lured into secret chambers where his smile was stolen and his body was mechanically transformed into a plaything for the masters of the entertainment industry. He died not of starvation, but his soul torn apart by the very system that promised to protect him. In the ecosystem of 1980s cinema, the teen idol was not just an actor, they were a psychological commodity. They were the bridge between the studio executives, who were pivoting away from the gritty realism of the 70s, and a new demographic of consumers armed with disposable income and a hunger for glossy rebellion. The industry needed children who could project a specific frequency of cool. They needed to be edgy but safe, vulnerable but untouchable, and above all, they needed to possess an innate radioactive charisma that could cut through the static of the box office and convince a generation that this face was the face of their dreams. It was into this high-stakes, voracious machinery that Corey Ian Haim was inserted. He was not born a casualty, but he was born with the precise emotional transparency the camera hunts for. Born on December the 23rd, 1971, in Toronto, Ontario, his coordinates were initially mundane, rooted in the quiet, snowy normalcy of Canadian suburbia. He was the son of Bernie, a sales representative, and Judy, a data processor, a life defined by hockey games and comic books rather than call sheets and residuals. He was the quiet observer, the shy boy in the back of the class. His entry into acting was an accident of therapy, a tool intended for social development to help a reserved child find his voice. It was meant to be a method of healing. It was never meant to be a death sentence. However, the camera possesses a predatory eye, and it found Corey Haim immediately. There is a specific quality that casting directors hunt for, a quality that cannot be taught in acting school. It is a transparency of the face. Most people have a mask. They hide their inner thoughts. Corey Haim had no mask. When he felt something, it registered on his face with absolute clarity. He possessed a raw emotional accessibility that was rare in adults and almost non-existent in children. It was this unguarded quality that allowed him to land his first role in the Canadian television series The Edison Twins. At that stage, it was safe, educational work rooted in his home country. It was a hobby that paid well, a diversion from the snowy normalcy of Toronto. But the industry south of the border was hungry for new inventory. The 1980s were dawning, and the entertainment machine was pivoting toward a new demographic. The era of the gritty adult dramas of the 70s was over. The era of the teenager was beginning. Hollywood needed faces that could sell cereal, video games, and the idea of innocent rebellion. The industry did not want complexities initially. They wanted a face. But Haim offered something disarming, a soul that vibrated on film. He was not the standard plastic child actor produced by the Hollywood machine. He was not a product of stage parents who had drilled him on elocution and tap dancing since birth. He was an accident of talent. He was a shy boy who stumbled into a medium that devoured shyness and spat out stardom. Casting directors saw a boy who didn't need to act, he just needed to be. This is a dangerous gift. To be natural on camera means you have no defenses. It means the world sees you naked. Corey's breakout role came in 1984 with the film Firstborn. He played the son of a woman dating a drug dealer. It was a serious role, demanding vulnerability and fear. He delivered. He held his own against established actors like Peter Weller and Terry Garr, displaying a naturalism that unnerved the professionals around him. The industry took notice. This wasn't just a cute kid reading lines off a cue card or mugging for a laugh track. This was an actor with an intuitive understanding of emotional pain. But it was the 1986 film Lucas that solidified his status as a legitimate talent. In Lucas, Haim played the title character, a socially awkward intellectual outcast in love with a popular girl. The role required him to be physically frail but emotionally resilient. It required him to be the punchline and the hero simultaneously. Watching Lucas today is a haunting experience. You are not watching a child star perform. You are watching a sensitive boy expose his own insecurities for a paycheck. The character was small, bullied, and desperate for connection, traits that Haim inhabited with a discomforting ease. He did not rely on the standard tricks of child acting. There was no precocious winking at the audience. There was only a profound, quiet sadness. Roger Ebert, the most respected critic in America, saw it. He wrote that Haim created one of the most three-dimensional, complex characters in the history of teen cinema. Ebert saw the potential for a long, serious career, a career like Dustin Hoffman or Al Pacino. He saw an artist capable of great depth. The industry, however, did not want an artist. They saw a product. They saw a face that could be printed on millions of posters. They saw the Haimster. This distinction is where the tragedy takes root. While an artist is nurtured, a product is simply manufactured, sold, and eventually discarded. Ebert saw a young Dustin Hoffman, but the studio heads saw a young David Cassidy. They saw dollar signs attached to a smile. They saw a demographic, teenage girls with disposable income, and they saw Haim as the key to unlocking that vault. They didn't want him to grow, to challenge himself, or to explore the human condition. They wanted him to stay cute. They wanted him to stay 14 forever. The shift from actor to commodity happened with violent speed. Following the critical success of Lucas, the Haim family relocated to Los Angeles. This migration is the first fatal error in the narrative of almost every child star. They left the grounding influence of their community, their extended family, and their normal routines to enter a city that functions as a company town for the manufacturing of fame. Los Angeles in 1986 was a city of excess. It was the height of the Reagan era, a time of conspicuous consumption, cocaine, and hairspray. For a 14-year-old boy from Toronto, it was another planet. The gentle rhythms of Canada were replaced by the frantic, sun-bleached hustle of Hollywood. In Toronto, he was a kid who acted. In Los Angeles, he was a business entity. The pressure to maintain his momentum was immediate. Every meeting, every audition was framed not as an artistic opportunity, but as a strategic move to capture market share. The geography of his life shrank. The world became a series of sound stages, trailers, and hotel rooms. The normalcy of school, hockey games, and snow days was traded for tutors, call sheets, and the relentless California sun. Los Angeles is a city that rewards surface over substance. It is a city built on the premise that you can reinvent yourself. But for a child, this reinvention is often dictated by others. Haim was malleable. He was eager to please. He walked into a city that eats the eager for breakfast. The role that detonated his life arrived in 1987. The film was The Lost Boys. The premise was high-concept perfection. Vampires in a California beach town, blending horror, comedy, and rock and roll. Haim was cast as Sam Emerson, the fashion-conscious, innocent younger brother who fights the undead. This film was not just a movie, it was a lifestyle branding exercise. It established the aesthetic of the late 80s. It was cool, slick, and designed to appeal directly to the teenage consumer. It also paired him for the first time with Corey Feldman. The Two Coreys brand was born on that set. It was not a friendship forged in a sandbox. It was a partnership forged in a casting office. They were opposites. Feldman was the streetwise, hard-edged kid who had been working since he was 3, a veteran of the Hollywood trenches. Haim was the soft, wide-eyed innocent from Canada, still possessing a lingering naivety. The chemistry was undeniable. It was the chemistry of a comedy duo, the straight man and the wild card. Warner Brothers realized they had struck gold. They didn't just market the movie, they marketed the boys. They saw the potential for a franchise that existed outside of any single film. The studio executives realized that by packaging them together, they could dominate the teen market completely. They were sold as a set, a package deal that promised double the box office returns. This partnership was lucrative, but it was also a trap. It locked Haim into a specific dynamic. He was the cute one. Feldman was the weird one. They were inseparable in the public eye. The industry began to view them not as individual actors, but as a unit. Scripts were written for the Two Coreys. Magazine covers were designed for the Two Coreys. They fed off each other's energy, but they also enabled each other's worst impulses. They were two boys given the keys to the kingdom with no one checking the map. By 1988, Corey Haim was the most famous teenager on the planet. The scale of the mania is difficult to comprehend in the modern fragmented media landscape. There was no internet, no Instagram, no TikTok. Fame was concentrated in a few specific outlets: magazines, MTV, and the box office. Haim dominated all three. He received 30,000 letters a week. The Postal Service had to make special arrangements to deliver the sacks of mail to his family's home. He couldn't walk into a mall. He couldn't go to a movie theater. If he stepped outside, he was swarmed by a mob of screaming girls who wanted to touch him, to own a piece of him. This was not admiration. It was consumption. The fans did not see a boy. They saw an object of desire that they had purchased with a movie ticket. They felt entitled to his time, his attention, and his physical space. He was pulled, grabbed, and screamed at wherever he went. The boundaries of his personal life evaporated. This level of adulation triggers a dopamine response in the brain that is biologically identical to cocaine. It creates a feedback loop of validation. Haim, who had been shy and reserved, was suddenly being told by the entire world that he was perfect. He was beautiful. He was the golden boy. The industry capitalized on this with ruthless efficiency. They launched the Corey Haim 1-900 hotline. The 1900 number is the ultimate symbol of the dehumanization of Corey Haim. The concept was simple. Fans would call a premium telephone number, charging their parents' phone bills $2 or $3 a minute, to hear a pre-recorded message from Corey. "Hi, this is Corey. I'm just hanging out. I love you." It was a simulacrum of intimacy. He was selling his voice, his simulated affection, to millions of strangers. The hotline generated millions of dollars in revenue. Haim was not acting. He was not creating art. He was simply existing as a voice on a loop, generating passive income for a corporation. This venture stripped away the last pretense that he was an artist. He was now a utility, a service provider dispensing synthetic romance to lonely teenagers. He spent hours in recording booths, reading scripts designed to manipulate the emotions of strangers, telling them He cared about them. While sitting alone in a soundproof room, it was a deeply cynical enterprise that reduced his personality to a monetizable asset. The psychological toll of this specific business model is devastating. It turned his existence into a commodity. Every word he spoke was calculated to extract money. He was selling pieces of himself, fragment by fragment. The disconnect between the voice on the phone, cheerful, loving, available, and the boy in the booth, tired, isolated, pressured, was profound. He was learning that his authentic self had no value. Only the performative version of Corey Haim was worth anything. He became a millionaire before he could drive. The money was staggering. He bought a Ferrari, he bought a Porsche, he bought a house in the Hollywood Hills, he wore Versace, he wore Rolexes. These purchases were not just the indulgences of a spoiled child, they were desperate attempts to construct an identity. He was trying to look the part of the movie star he was told he was. He became the primary breadwinner for his entire family. His father, Bernie, and his mother, Judy, had divorced, a fracture that deeply wounded Haim. He felt a responsibility to fill the void, to be the man of the house. With his father back in Canada, Haim became the financial patriarch at 16. This inversion of the natural order is toxic. A child cannot lead a family. A child cannot wield economic power over his parents without destroying the parent-child dynamic. Judy Haim became his manager. She was his mother, but she was also his employee. Her lifestyle, her home, her car, all depended on Corey showing up to the set and smiling. The traditional boundaries of authority were erased. How does a mother discipline a son who pays the mortgage? How does a parent enforce a curfew when the child is the CEO of the family business? This economic reality created a terrifying dependency. Haim was not just working for himself, he was working to sustain an ecosystem. Agents, managers, publicists, and family members all drew sustenance from his labor. He was the host organism. If he stopped, the ecosystem collapsed. This burden is crushing for a grown man. For a teenager, it is catastrophic. It creates a paralyzing fear of failure. Every audition becomes a matter of survival. Every bad review feels like a threat to the family's shelter. He was carrying the weight of the world in a Versace jacket. The pressure was atmospheric. Haim was aware that the entire enterprise rested on his shoulders. If he stopped working, the Ferrari would be repossessed. If he stopped smiling, the fan letters would stop coming. He was trapped in a golden cage of his own making. He had to be Corey Haim 24 hours a day. He developed a persona to cope with the exposure. He became brash. He became loud. He adopted the affectations of the Hollywood elite. He started wearing sunglasses indoors and speaking with an unearned swagger. But inside, the shy boy from Toronto was screaming. He was performing a caricature of himself, a version of Corey Haim that was confident and untouchable, because the reality of his vulnerability was too dangerous to expose. The disconnect between the public persona and the private fear began to widen, creating a psychological chasm that he struggled to bridge. He constructed a shell of arrogance to protect the soft center. He acted out. He made demands. The industry tolerated it because he was profitable, but they marked it down in their ledgers. They labeled him difficult. They labeled him a brat. They didn't see the panic attack behind the sunglasses. They didn't see a boy terrified that the ride would end. They just saw a monster of their own creation. And like Frankenstein, they eventually grew to fear and resent the thing they had built. The industry demanded more. They wanted license to drive. They wanted dream a little dream. They wanted the two Coreys to be everywhere. The workload was crushing. 12-hour days on set, followed by interviews, followed by photo shoots. He was living on adrenaline and caffeine. He was exhausted. And in Hollywood, when a valuable asset is exhausted, the solution is never rest. The solution is chemistry. This is where the darkness begins to bleed into the frame. The narrative of the party boy is a convenient lie the media tells to sell magazines. Haim did not start using drugs because he wanted to have a good time at a club. He started using drugs because he was in pain and he needed to work. The industry is awash in pharmaceuticals. If an actor has a headache, there is a pill. If an actor is tired, there is a powder. If an actor is anxious, there is a liquid. Haim was introduced to this pharmacopoeia by the very people who were paid to protect him. This was not a recreational descent. It was a professional requirement. The schedule of a teen idol in the late 1980s was not designed for a human biological system. It was designed for a machine. Haim was required to be energetic at 6 a.m. for a master shot, charming at noon for a press junket, and focused at midnight for a close-up. The human body cannot sustain that rhythm on adrenaline alone. It breaks down, the mind fogs, the muscles cramp. But production cannot stop. The burn rate of a Hollywood set is measured in tens of thousands of dollars per hour. A tired child is a financial liability. When the natural energy failed, the industry provided a synthetic replacement. It started benignly. A doctor on set, paid by the studio, would notice the young star flagging. They would offer a vitamin shot, then a mild stimulant, then something stronger to ensure the production stayed on schedule. The logic was cold and economic. A delayed hour on a film set costs thousands of dollars. A pill costs pennies. Haim was the asset that needed to be kept running, and chemistry was the fuel. The drugs became the infrastructure of his day. They regulated his moods, his energy, and his sleep. He lost the ability to understand his own body's signals. Tiredness was not a signal to sleep. It was a signal to take a stimulant. Anxiety was not a signal to rest. It was a signal to take a depressant. He was rewiring his physiology before he had even finished puberty. The adults around him saw this not as addiction, but as management. As long as he hit his marks and smiled for the camera, the method of his maintenance was irrelevant. He was a racehorse being injected to run one more lap. No one asked about the long-term cost to the animal. They only cared about the race being run today. But the drugs were not just for the physical exhaustion. They were for the secret. While the public saw the magazine covers, Corey Haim was living through a private hell that would not be revealed for decades. The access that his fame granted him was a double-edged sword. It got him into the best restaurants, but it also put him in rooms with men who viewed him as fresh meat. The power dynamic in 1980s. Hollywood was feudal. The studio executives, the producers, the power brokers, they were the lords. The actors were the serfs. And a beautiful, young, unprotected boy was a delicacy. This is the ugliest truth of Haim's life, the rot at the center of the golden apple. The industry was not just indifferent to his safety. Parts of it were actively predatory. Haim was a commodity in every sense of the word. His face sold tickets, and his body was viewed as a perk of the trade for powerful men. These were men who controlled the green lights. They controlled the casting. They controlled the narrative. To a teenage boy whose entire family depended on his success, these men were gods. You do not say no to a god. You do not defy the person who holds the keys to your existence. Corey Feldman would later describe this era as a feeding frenzy. He spoke of a wolf pack of monsters operating with impunity within the industry. Haim was their prime target. He was separated from his parents during auditions. He was invited to private meetings in bungalows and trailers. He was told that this was how the business worked. He was told that if he wanted the lead role, if he wanted the magazine cover, He had to be a good boy. The grooming process was sophisticated and brutal. It relied on the systematic isolation of the victim. Parents were kept in waiting rooms, distracted by assistants or engaged in contract talks, while their sons were ushered into inner sanctums. The predators presented the abuse as mentorship, as affection, or as a rite of passage. They exploited Haim's desire to please, his professional ambition, and his naivety. They blurred the lines between professional favors and unspeakable demands until the boy could no longer distinguish between an audition and an assault. They made him feel special while they were destroying him. They told him he was the chosen one, the next big thing, and that this secret was the bond between the elite. The abuse was not a singular event, it was systemic. It was a condition of his employment. He was passed around, and then he was sent back out to the set to smile for the camera. The cognitive dissonance required to survive this is unimaginable. To be violated in the dark and then worshipped in the light creates a fracture in the soul. He felt dirty. He felt worthless. He felt that his body did not belong to him. It belonged to the studio, to the fans, and to the predators. He was an object to be used, consumed, and discarded. This fracture creates a specific kind of psychological agony. Haim had to maintain two distinct realities. In one reality, he was the beloved heartthrob, the object of innocent crushes for millions of girls. He was the safe, wholesome boy next door. In the other reality, he was a victim, powerless and degraded. The effort to keep these two worlds separate was exhausting. Every time a fan screamed his name, he had to wonder if they saw the filth he felt inside. Every time he saw his own face on a billboard, he saw a lie. He began to loathe the image of Corey Haim because he knew the cost of maintaining it. The face on the poster was the face that had been bought and paid for in the back rooms of Hollywood. He couldn't tell his mother. He was the protector. He was the one buying the house. How could he tell her that he was being destroyed? He couldn't tell the police. Who would believe a teenager against the titans of the industry? He was silenced by shame and by the terrifying reality of his economic power. If he spoke up, the money train would stop. The family would lose everything. The house, the cars, the lifestyle, it all rested on his silence. He was trapped by his own success. He felt a crushing responsibility to maintain the illusion for the sake of the people he loved. So he swallowed the secret. He buried it deep inside where it began to fester. The silence was a prison. He carried the weight of the abuse alone. To speak would be to detonate his life. It would mean admitting that the dream was a nightmare. It would mean confronting the fact that the people who were supposed to protect him had failed, or worse, had traded him for access. The shame was corrosive. It ate away at his self-worth. He began to believe that he deserved the abuse, that it was the price of admission to the VIP room. This internalized shame is the predator's greatest weapon. It ensures that the victim remains compliant, silent, and self-destructive, and he reached for the painkillers. The introduction of prescription opiates and sedatives was the beginning of the end. Valium became his best friend. Vicodin became his lover. These drugs did exactly what he needed them to do. They numbed him. They built a wall between his conscious mind and the memories of the abuse. When he was high, he didn't have to think about the man in the car. When he was high, he didn't have to feel the shame. He could just float. He could disappear into a chemical fog where nothing mattered, where the pain was distant and dull. The chemistry offered a solution to the pain that therapy could not touch. Therapy requires talking. Drugs require swallowing. For a boy who could not speak about what was happening to him, the pill was the only way out. It provided a chemical dissociation. Under the influence of Valium, the sharp edges of his trauma were filed down. The anxiety that lived in his chest, a constant humming vibration of terror, was silenced. He was taking drugs simply to reach a baseline of functionality. He was medicating a soul murder. He was trying to anesthetize a wound that would never heal. The escalation was rapid. Tolerance is a biological fact. The body learns to process the poison. The one pill that offered relief in 1987 became 2 pills in 1988, then a handful. His body adapted to the chemicals, demanding more to achieve the same numbing effect. He began to mix substances, alcohol to boost the sedatives, cocaine to wake up from the sedatives. He became a chemist of his own misery, constantly adjusting the dosage to maintain a state of suspended animation. He wanted to be present enough to work, but absent enough not to feel. It was an impossible balance to strike. He was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and the net was made of pills. By 1989, on the set of Dream a Little Dream, the cracks in the facade were becoming canyons. He broke his leg during production. The pain was real, but it was also an opportunity. It was a legitimate reason to take more pills. The studio doctors prescribed them. He took them by the handful. His behavior on set deteriorated. He became difficult. He showed up late. He slurred his words. He was argumentative. He was erratic. The crew didn't see the pain. They saw a brat. They didn't see the abuse. They saw arrogance. The set of Dream a Little Dream became a public display of his disintegration. The crew watched as the one-take kid struggled to remember his lines. They watched him nod off between takes. They watched his temper flare over minor inconveniences. The professionalism that had defined his early career evaporated. He was no longer the reliable worker. He was a liability. The broken leg was a physical manifestation of his internal state. He was hobbled. He was in pain. And he was using that pain as a shield to justify his consumption. He waved his prescription bottle like a flag of surrender. The dynamics on set shifted. The adults who had fawned over him began to look at him with annoyance. Time is money, and Haim was wasting time. They didn't see a boy in crisis. They saw a spoiled brat who was partying too hard. They didn't see the trauma. They saw the symptom. This misinterpretation is common in the industry. The cry for help is interpreted as a lack of discipline. Instead of intervention, he received judgment. Instead of help, he received enablement, followed by scorn. The very people who had looked the other way when he was being abused now looked down on him for the way he coped with it. The industry, which had created the environment for his abuse and supplied the drugs to cover it up, now began to turn on him. They didn't see a victim. They saw a liability. The golden boy was tarnishing. Rumors began to circulate. Haim was a mess. Haim was uninsurable. The phone calls from the A-list directors began to slow down. The scripts that arrived were no longer for prestige dramas. They were for teen comedies that felt derivative and tired. The quality of the work offered is the first indicator of a career in freefall. Word travels fast in Hollywood. The uninsurable tag is a career death sentence. It means that bonding companies, the entities that insure film productions against loss, refuse to cover a project if that actor is involved. They view the actor as a risk of overdose, a risk of delay, a risk of death. Once Haim was marked as a risk, the major studios backed away. They were running businesses, not charities. They would exploit him when he was profitable, and they would discard him when he became difficult. The machinery that had built him up was now systematically dismantling him. The roles that were offered reflected this shift in status. He was no longer being considered for serious, character-driven pieces that would help him transition into adult acting. He was being offered caricatures of his former self. He was typecast as the goofy teen, the sidekick, the heartthrob. He was trapped playing a version of himself that he had outgrown and come to despise. He was 18, desperate to be taken seriously as a man and an artist, but the industry only wanted the boy on the lunchbox. And even then, they only wanted him if he showed up on time. They wanted the brand, not the human. He could feel the withdrawal of the love. The executives who used to take his calls were suddenly in meetings. The parties he used to headline were suddenly at capacity. The entourage began to thin out. The hangers-on, the people who were there for the free drinks and the proximity to fame, smelled the decline. They began to drift toward the next big thing. This abandonment reinforced his isolation. It confirmed his deepest fear, that he was only loved for what he could provide, not for who he was. He was a resource that had been depleted. The physical toll was becoming visible. The camera, once his lover, became his prosecutor. It captured the puffiness in his face, the deadness in his eyes. The transparency that had made him a star now worked against him. He couldn't hide the damage. The lens magnified every flaw, every moment of hesitation, every sign of chemical alteration. Audiences, even the adoring teenage girls, began to sense that something was wrong. The sparkle was gone. The smile didn't reach his eyes. He looked tired. He looked like a boy who had seen too much. The innocence was replaced by a grimace. Haim tried to fight the tide. He tried to act normal. He gave interviews where he denied the drug use, where he talked about his excitement for the future. But the lies were thin. He was fighting a war on three fronts: against his addiction, against his trauma, and against an industry that was actively erasing him. He was outgunned. He had no support system. His mother was fighting her own battles, trying to manage a career that was slipping through her fingers, terrified for her son, but lacking the tools to save him. She watched him drown, paralyzed by the fear that stopping the work meant starving. The financial pressure did not abate. The lifestyle he had built required a constant influx of cash. The Ferrari needed gas, the house needed a mortgage payment, the family needed support, and the addiction needed feeding. The cost of maintaining a heavy opiate habit is astronomical. Haim was burning through his savings to pay for the pills that kept him functioning. He was working to pay for the drugs that allowed him to work. It was a closed loop of destruction. He was running on a treadmill that was moving faster than he could run, and the incline was increasing every day. As 1989 drew to a close, the cultural landscape was shifting beneath his feet. The decade of excess was ending. The public was growing tired of the polished, plastic aesthetic of the 80s. They were hungry for something real, something raw. The Two Coreys act, once the height of cool, was beginning to look like a novelty act. The jokes were stale. The dynamic was repetitive. The audience was growing up and they were leaving Haim behind. The screams were getting quieter. The mailbags were getting lighter. The world was moving on. He was 18 years old. In the span of 4 years, he had risen to the absolute peak of cultural relevance, generated millions of dollars, been sexually assaulted repeatedly, and developed a crippling drug addiction. He had lived a lifetime of trauma before he was old enough to vote, and the decade that had defined him, the 1980s, was coming to a close. The neon was fading. The world was changing. And Corey Haim was about to be left behind in the dark. The 1990s arrived like a cultural guillotine. If the 80s were defined by excess, gloss, and artificiality, the 90s demanded authenticity, grit, and irony. On September 24, 1991, Nirvana released Nevermind, and practically overnight the aesthetic that Corey Haim embodied became obsolete. The cultural shift was seismic and violent. The teased hair, The neon windbreakers and the wide-eyed innocence were no longer currency. They were punchlines. The audience that had worshipped him grew up. They traded their Tiger Beat magazines for Rolling Stone and Spin. They wanted Brad Pitt, Johnny Depp, and River Phoenix, actors who projected danger, dirt, and depth. They wanted broken men, not broken boys. Corey Haim, with his frozen-in-time smile and his eagerness to please, was a relic of a decade everyone was trying to flush away. He was a living artifact, a reminder of a party that had gone on too long and ended in a hangover. The industry is unsentimental about obsolescence. It does not send a thank you note for services rendered. The transition from A-list to has-been was not a gradual slide. It was a cliff. The phone simply stopped ringing. The scripts for major studio films vanished from his mailbox. In their place came the offers for the direct-to-video market. This is the shadow economy of Hollywood, a purgatory where former stars go to cash checks in movies that will never see the inside of a theater. It is a world of low budgets, rushed schedules, and indifferent crews. Haim accepted them because he had to. The overhead of his life, the house in the hills, the luxury cars, the family expenses, and the escalating drug habit remained astronomical, even as his income plummeted. He was running a multinational corporation on a minimum wage budget. The math didn't work. The burn rate of his lifestyle was unsustainable, yet he was terrified to downsize because downsizing was an admission of defeat. To sell the Ferrari was to admit the dream was over. He starred in films like Prayer of the Roller Boys. While it developed a niche cult following years later, at the time it marked a distinct, humiliating step down in production value. He was skating in a dystopian future, wearing a trench coat, trying to look tough, but the metaphor was too close to home. He was skating on thin ice. The joy was gone from his performance. The transparency that had made him a star was still there, but now it was revealing something uncomfortable. If you look at his eyes in these films, the spark of Lucas is extinguished. You see a young man reciting lines to pay for a prescription. You see a man checking the clock, waiting for the rap, waiting for the release. He was trading words for cash and cash for chemical oblivion. Then, the physical toll of his chemical diet began to manifest in terrifying ways. The human body is resilient, but it has limits. Haim had been feeding his system a toxic cocktail of Valium, Vicodin, and cocaine since puberty. He had rewired his neural pathways before they were fully formed. In 1993, the bill came due. He suffered a drug-induced stroke that left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. The image is harrowing. The boy who had been an agile skateboarding icon in The Lost Boys, the kid who moved with a kinetic nervous energy, was now bedridden, unable to move his legs. He was trapped in a body that had rebelled against him. The immobility led to rapid, massive weight gain. He ballooned to over 200 pounds. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a bloated, frightened stranger. For an actor whose entire value proposition was based on physical beauty and youth, this was a death sentence. The industry can forgive bad acting. It rarely forgives the loss of beauty. The tabloids, which had once printed his pinups and fueled his rise, now turned on him with predatory glee. They ran photos of his weight gain with cruel, dehumanizing headlines. They didn't ask why he was suffering. They mocked him for getting fat. They stripped him of his dignity when he was at his most vulnerable. They turned his medical crisis into a sideshow. The paralysis eventually subsided, but the damage to his reputation was permanent. He was now viewed as a liability. Insurers refused to bond him for films. Directors didn't want to hire a 22-year-old who might stroke out on set. The risk assessment was cold and binary. Corey Haim was a bad bet. The stigma of addiction is a powerful branding iron in Hollywood. Once you are marked as troubled, the A-list parties stop sending invitations. The inner circle closes ranks. The isolation deepened. He sat in his rental home surrounded by the memorabilia of a career that was effectively over, while the silence of the phone screamed at him. He was a young man with a lifetime of memories and no future. In a bizarre intersection of pop culture trajectories, 1995 offered a glimpse of what could have been. Haim briefly dated Victoria Adams, the woman who would soon become Posh Spice, and later, a global fashion icon and business mogul. At that moment, they were arguably peers. Perhaps Haim was even the more recognizable face. But their paths diverged with brutal clarity. Victoria ascended to the stratosphere of global fame and wealth. She understood branding. She understood evolution. She knew how to pivot. Haim continued his descent into the basement of obscurity. He was stuck in the past, trying to play a game that had already ended. This contrast serves as a stark reminder of the lottery nature of fame. One person rides the wave, the other drowns beneath it. By 1997, the financial house of cards collapsed. Haim filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Los Angeles. The court documents were a public autopsy of his finances. They revealed a tragedy of mismanagement and consumption. The millions earned from the Lost Boys and License to Drive were gone, vanished. There were no investments. There was no safety net. There was no trust fund. The money had been eaten by the drugs, the lifestyle, the taxes, and the hangers-on who fled the moment the tap ran dry. His listed assets were pathetic. A 1987 BMW that was falling apart, a few $100s in cash, clothing valued at $750. Think about that number. The wardrobe of the most famous teenager in the world was worth less than $1,000. Against this pittance, he owed the IRS over $200,000 in back taxes. He owed medical bills. He owed credit card companies. The ATM machine of the Haim family was empty. The boy who had supported everyone was now destitute. The bankruptcy filing forced Haim and his mother Judy out of their comfortable lifestyle. They began a nomadic existence, bouncing between rental apartments, motels, and guest houses in the San Fernando Valley. The dynamic between mother and son became increasingly claustrophobic. Judy was his mother, but she was also his only friend, his enabler, and his dependent. They were locked in a cycle of mutual destruction. She needed him to work to survive. He needed her to function because he had never learned basic adult skills. He didn't know how to pay a bill. He didn't know how to do laundry. He didn't know how to cook a meal. He didn't know how to function in a world that didn't cater to him. He had been infantilized by fame, kept in a state of permanent adolescence, and now he was a helpless adult living in a state of arrested development. They were two people clinging to a raft in the middle of the ocean, drinking seawater to stay alive. Desperation breeds humiliation. As the 90s bled into the 2000s, Haim's need for cash to fuel his addiction became the driving force of his life. The drugs were no longer about numbing the trauma of the sexual abuse. They were about staving off the excruciating physical sickness of withdrawal. An addict in withdrawal will do anything to stop the pain. The dignity of the actor was replaced by the survival instinct of the junkie. The priority shifted from getting a role to getting well, and getting well meant getting high. In 2001, Corey Haim hit a nadir that shocked even the cynical observers of Hollywood. He turned to the internet. He set up an account on eBay. He didn't sell old scripts or costumes. He sold pieces of his own body. He listed clumps of his own hair. He listed his pulled wisdom teeth. It was a grotesque spectacle. The man who had been the object of desire for a generation was now butchering himself for pocket change. He was literally selling his DNA to strangers. It was a commodification of the self that bordered on body horror. The media picked up the story not with sympathy, but with morbid curiosity. "Look at how far he has fallen," they sneered. No one asked about the desperation required to sell your own teeth online. They didn't ask about the mental state of a man packaging his own hair. They just laughed. eBay eventually shut down the auction, citing policies against selling body parts, denying him even that small, degrading payday. The rejection was total. Even his own biology was deemed unsellable. But Haim wasn't done begging. Later that year, he scraped together what little money he had left to purchase a full-page advertisement in Variety, the industry's trade newspaper. This is the forum where studios announce billion-dollar mergers and Oscar campaigns. It is a place of power, a place where success talks to success. Haim's ad was stark, a black and white headshot, clearly aged, looking tired but trying to smile. The text was simple and devastating. "This is Corey Haim. I'm ready to work. I'm ready to make amends." It was a public confession. It was a plea for mercy from the executioners. He was asking the industry that had abused him, chewed him up, and spat him out to please let him back in. He was willing to debase himself publicly for a chance to read a script. He was saying, "I am still here. I am still useful. Please use me." He was apologizing for being broken by the people he was apologizing to. The response from Hollywood was silence, absolute crushing silence. The phone didn't ring. The producers didn't care. To them, he was damaged goods. He was a risk. Why hire Corey Haim with his baggage and his drug habit when you could hire the next fresh-faced 18-year-old who hadn't been broken yet? The ad didn't restart his career. It cemented his status as a pathetic figure. It stripped away the last shred of his dignity. It proved that his name no longer held power. It proved that in a town built on second chances, some people don't even get one. Amidst this wreckage, the relationship with Corey Feldman, the other half of the two Coreys, was fracturing. Feldman had traveled a similar road of abuse and addiction, but he had taken a different turn. Feldman got sober. He got married. He tried to build a life outside the haze of narcotics. He tried to reinvent himself. He was fighting to grow up. He was trying to break the cycle. Feldman watched his friend drowning and tried to throw him a rope, but Haim wouldn't or couldn't grab it. The dynamic shifted from partners to a painful asymmetry. Feldman was the together one. Haim was the mess. Feldman attempted tough love. He distanced himself, refusing to enable Haim's behavior. He told Haim he couldn't be around him until he was clean. He drew a boundary to save his own life. For Haim, this was the ultimate abandonment. Feldman was the only person on earth who truly understood the specific, unique trauma they had shared. He was the only witness to the crimes of the 80s. He was the only one who knew what happened in those trailers. When Feldman pulled away, Haim felt untethered. He was alone in a world that didn't understand him, surrounded by yes men and drug dealers who only wanted to be close to the fading heat of his fame. He lost his mirror. He lost the only person who could validate his reality. Without Feldman, the memories of the abuse had no external verification. Haim was left alone in the dark with his ghosts. The early 2000s were a blur of cheap motels and doctors' offices. Haim became a master of doctor shopping. The American healthcare system is fragmented, and before centralized digital records, it was easy to manipulate. Haim would visit a doctor in Santa Monica, complaining of back pain from an old stunt injury. He would get a script for Vicodin. Then he would drive to the valley, see a different doctor, complain of a migraine, and get a script for Valium. Then to Beverly Hills for Soma. It was a full-time job. He was acting again, but his audience was a rotating cast of physicians, and his fee was a bottle of pills. He utilized his charm, his fame, and his manipulation skills to convince medical professionals to feed his habit. He became a cog in a massive underground economy of prescription fraud. He wasn't just a user. Reports suggest he was procuring pills for others to pay his rent. The Golden Boy had become a mule. He was trading his famous name for access to the pharmacy. Doctors, starstruck or corrupt, wrote the scripts. They were accomplices in his slow suicide. They saw a celebrity and forgot their oath. His appearance deteriorated further. His teeth, ravaged by years of drug use and poor hygiene, began to rot and fall out. He developed a lisp. The dazzling smile that had been insured for millions, the smile that had sold millions of magazines, was now a gap-toothed ruin. He stopped looking in mirrors. The physical transformation was a manifestation of the internal rot. The boy from Lucas was dead. The man in the mirror was a stranger. He wore baggy clothes to hide his weight. He wore hats to hide his thinning hair. He was hiding from himself. He was hiding from the world. He took roles in movies that barely qualify as cinema. Titles like Universal Groove, Dickie Roberts, former child star, where he played a caricature of himself, and American Sunset. These were not attempts at art, they were attempts at survival. On set, he was often a ghost, present physically but mentally absent. He delivered lines with a flat, dead affect. The eyes that had once captivated Roger Ebert were now glassy and vacant. He was a prop. He was hired for the novelty of his name on the DVD box, not for his talent. He was hired so the producers could say, "We got Corey Haim." It was stunt casting of the most depressing variety. Yet, the instinct to survive is a powerful force. In 2007, a lifeline appeared. It came in the form of the new dominant medium of the decade, reality television. The A&E network commissioned a show, The Two Coreys. The premise was simple: reunite Haim and Feldman, have them live together, and film the fireworks. It was marketed as a buddy comedy, a nostalgia trip. The reality was a televised mental breakdown. Haim saw the show as his big comeback. He thought this was his return to the A-list. He thought this was his chance to show the world he was back. He didn't realize he was being cast as the villain. Or worse, the clown. The cameras didn't protect him. They exploited his illness for ratings. Reality TV does not require acting. It requires conflict. And Haim was a walking conflict. The show captured Haim in the depths of his addiction. He was erratic, emotional, and often incoherent. He fought with Feldman's wife. He cried. He slept all day. He was high on camera, though he denied it. The audience watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was a car crash in slow motion. The editing room weaponized his pain. They took the footage of a sick man and cut it to look like the antics of a selfish jerk. They didn't provide help, they provided lighting. They didn't call a therapist, they called a producer. Millions of people tuned in to watch the disintegration of a human being, framed as entertainment. The climax of the show was not a triumphant return, but a public severing. In the finale, Corey Feldman, exhausted and fearful for his own sobriety, told Haim on camera that they could no longer be friends. He told him he wouldn't watch him die. "I love you, but I can't do this anymore." It was a staged intervention, broadcast to millions. Haim was devastated. The show that was supposed to save him had destroyed his last meaningful relationship. He was fired from the second season of his own show. The network continued with Feldman, leaving Haim behind. The producers decided that a sober Feldman was a story, but a using Haim was a liability. They cut him loose. They squeezed the last drop of drama out of him and then discarded the husk. The message was clear. Even in the trashy world of reality TV, Corey Haim was too broken to be employable. He retreated back to the shadows. He moved back in with his mother in the Oakwood apartments. He was 38 years old, living like a teenager, dependent on his mother for food, shelter, and emotional support. The year 2010 began with a bleak outlook. Haim was sick. He had flu-like symptoms that wouldn't go away. He was weak. His body battered by decades of chemical assault, had no immune system left to fight. He was still hustling. He was still trying to set up meetings. He was talking about a sequel to License to Drive. He was talking about writing a memoir. He was talking about exposing the names of the men who had raped him. But the clock had run out. The machinery had extracted every ounce of value. There was nothing left to sell. On the night of March 9th, 2010, the Los Angeles rain was falling hard against the stucco walls of the Oakwood complex. Inside Unit 203, the temperature was cold. Corey Haim lay in bed, shivering. He felt heavy. He looked at his mother, Judy, the woman who had been there for the first audition, the first check, the first premiere, and the first overdose. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't feel good." He tried to stand up. His legs, the legs that had once danced and skated, gave way. He collapsed onto the floor. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't thrashing. He simply folded. The silence that followed was heavy and final. It was the silence of a factory shutting down. The product was finished. The ambulance arrived at the Oakwood apartments minutes later. The paramedics found a man who looked decades older than 38. They loaded him onto the gurney, rushing him through the rain-slicked streets of Burbank to Providence St. Joseph Medical Center. It was a futile dash. The machinery of his body had already seized. At 2:15 a.m. on March 10, 2010, the doctors ceased their efforts. Corey Haim was pronounced dead. The news broke with the speed of the digital age, a sharp contrast to the slow-motion car crash of his final years. The headlines were predictable. Child star dead of overdose. Corey Haim, the final high. The media, conditioned by 2 decades of mugshots and reality TV meltdowns, wrote the obituary before the ink was dry on the death certificate. They assumed he had finally taken the lethal dose he had been flirting with since 1989. But the Los Angeles County Coroner's report, released weeks later, told a different, starker story. While traces of prescription medication were found, there were no illegal drugs. There was no massive overdose. The narcotics that had defined his public image were not the killers that night. The cause of death was listed as diffuse alveolar damage, pneumonia, and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. In plain English, his lungs were filled with fluid and his heart was too big. It was a death of exhaustion. His heart, enlarged to nearly twice the size of a normal man's, had simply worked too hard for too long. It had beaten through the terror of the abuse, the adrenaline of the fame, the chemical storms of the addiction, and the crushing stress of poverty. It finally gave out. He didn't die from a drug binge. He died because his body was worn out. He died a death usually reserved for the elderly, not a man who should have been in the prime of his life. The tragedy of his death was immediately followed by the indignity of his burial. The Haim family was destitute. The millions earned in the 80s were a distant memory. Judy Haim had to appeal to the public for help. The city of Toronto, his hometown, refused to cover the costs. A celebrity memorabilia site offered to pay for the funeral in exchange for some of Corey's personal items, a final ghoulish attempt to monetize him. Fans started a donation fund, but the backlash was vicious, accusing the mother of profiting from the tragedy. She eventually canceled the fund. The funeral took place in Toronto on March 16th. It was a small private affair. But the most significant person in Corey Haim's life was absent. Corey Feldman was not there. On the morning of the funeral, Feldman received an email from the Haim family. He was told not to come. They blamed him. They believed the tough love he administered on the two Coreys, the public rejection, had pushed Haim over the edge. They viewed Feldman not as a brother, but as an accomplice to the stress that stopped Corey's heart. Feldman grieved alone in Los Angeles. The two Coreys, the duo that had defined a generation, ended in a silence enforced by grief and resentment. Feldman would later visit the grave alone, reading a letter to the dirt, apologizing for not being able to save him. The aftermath of Haim's death triggered a seismic shift in Hollywood, though the tremors were initially ignored. For years, Haim had hinted at the darkness. In interviews, he spoke in codes. He mentioned people who had hurt him. He mentioned the vampires in the industry. He was dismissed as a paranoid junkie. But with Haim gone, Corey Feldman stopped speaking in codes. He began to name the crime, if not the criminals. He went on national television and declared that Corey Haim had been raped. He described a pedophile ring that operated with impunity in the 1980s. He described parties where children were passed around like hors d'oeuvres. He revealed that the drug addict narrative was a cover story. Haim wasn't a party animal. He was a trauma survivor self-medicating to silence the memories of rectal bleeding and sexual humiliation. The public and the industry had spent 20 years mocking a victim. Corey Haim was the patient zero of the reckoning that would eventually sweep through the entertainment industry. His broken life was the evidence. His death was the indictment. He took the names of his abusers to the grave, names that are still whispered in the back rooms of Hollywood, but his absence created a void that could no longer be filled with lies. The legacy of Corey Haim is not found in the bargain bins of DVD stores. It is not found in the punchlines of late-night comedians. It is found in the harsh light of truth. He serves as a permanent tragic warning about the commodification of children. He proves that the smile on the poster is often a mask for the scream in the dressing room. We end not with the image of the bloated corpse in Burbank, nor with the mugshot. We wipe that away. We return to 1987, Santa Cruz, the boardwalk. Sam Emerson is wearing a bright, wild shirt. He is laughing. He is confident. He looks into the camera with eyes that are clear, mischievous, and painfully alive. He is 16 years old. The world is at his feet. The monsters in the movie are fake. They are just actors in prosthetics. He can defeat them with a stake and a one-liner. But outside the frame, the real monsters are waiting in the executive suites. They are checking their watches. They are waiting for the sun to go down. Corey Haim never stood a chance. He fought them for 20 years with the only weapon he had, his own body, until there was nothing left to fight with. The lost boy is finally found resting in the quiet earth of Ontario, far away from the lights that burned him alive.